It started with a lie. The man who told it was a Harvard-educated doctor living on a California ranch. The lie was in a letter. The letter described a paradise. Warm valleys, fertile soil, mountain passes gentle enough for wagons, a journey no harder than a Sunday ride. It described everything except the desert, the mountains, the 40 miles of waterless wasteland between the two. That letter reached Missouri in the winter of 1840. A young man named John Bidwell read it, believed it, and organized 68 other people to follow him into the most hostile terrain in North America, terrain that, by the time they reached it, had already killed their animals, destroyed their wagons, and reduced them to eating leather. The letter was wrong about almost everything, and they went anyway. Welcome to Western Pioneer Archives. The story of the first overland wagon expedition to California is one of the great forgotten epics of American exploration. A journey made by ordinary people with extraordinary stubbornness through country so hostile it nearly broke them completely. If you want more history like this, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. And we want to hear from you in the comments. If you had been standing on that Missouri riverbank in 1841 with half a map and no guarantee of survival, would you have gone? Let's find out what happened to the people who did. The year was 1841, and the American West was, in a precise and literal sense, unknown. Not unknown the way we use that word today, meaning unfamiliar or off the beaten path. Unknown in the way that a blank space on a map is unknown. Unknown the way that darkness beyond a campfire is unknown. The territory between the Missouri River and the Pacific coast existed in the American imagination as rumor, speculation, and the competing claims of fur trappers who agreed on almost nothing except that the mountains were high, the deserts were brutal, and the distances were greater than anyone wanted to admit. California in 1841 was not American territory. It belonged to Mexico. The great ranching estates, the ranchos, stretched across the coastal valleys, worked by indigenous labor under a mission system that had already been officially secularized in 1833, but whose social and economic structures persisted through the mission-era arrangements between church, state, and the native peoples it had drawn into its orbit. A small population of American and European traders lived in the coastal towns, doing business with Mexican ranchers and the occasional hide and tallow ship from New England. The interior valleys, what would one day become the great agricultural heartland of the nation, were virtually unknown to American settlers. Even the mountain passes that divided the Sierra Nevada from the Central Valley had not been systematically mapped or recorded in any document available to the people now gathering on the Missouri frontier. What Americans did know by 1841 was that California was there, that it was warm, that the soil in the valleys was reportedly extraordinary, and that getting there overland had never been done. That last fact was both the problem and, for a certain kind of person, the point. The men and women who gathered at Sapling Grove, near present-day Independence, Missouri, in the spring of 1841, were not, for the most part, adventurers. They were not soldiers or mountain men or trained explorers. They were farmers and teachers and clerks and tradespeople driven west by a collision of desperation and hope that was already becoming a distinctly American pattern. The economic panic of 1837 had wrecked the country. Banks had failed by the hundreds. Land prices had collapsed. Men who had worked for years to establish themselves found their savings gone and their futures uncertain. The credit economy that had fueled rapid Western expansion in the early 1830s had seized up suddenly and completely, and the recovery was slow, uneven, and deeply discouraging to people who had done everything right and still found themselves without resources or prospects. The letters coming back from Oregon and California few as they were, described a land where that could not happen, where the soil was so rich you barely had to work it, where the climate was mild enough to grow crops year-round, where a man could start over without the dead weight of Eastern debt and Eastern land prices pressing down on him. There was also the matter of Texas. In 1836, Americans in Mexican Texas had declared independence, fought a war, and won. The Republic of Texas was a functioning, if precarious, political entity by 1841, and its existence demonstrated something that many Americans had been thinking quietly for years, that the southwestern portions of the North American continent were not permanently Mexican. The expansionist ambitions of the United States were not yet official government policy. That would come later, wrapped in the rhetoric of manifest destiny. But they were already present in the minds of many ordinary Americans who looked at a map and saw a continent that was not, in their view, being fully utilized. Into this volatile mixture of economic desperation and expansionist ambition stepped a young man named John Bidwell. Bidwell was 21 years old in 1841, and he had already had enough bad luck to last most men a lifetime. Born in New York in 1819, he had worked his way west as a teenager, eventually settling in Missouri and then moving to the Platte Purchase, a strip of land recently acquired from the Platte River Sac and Fox peoples in northwestern Missouri, where he had filed a land claim and begun to build something resembling a life for himself. He had staked out his claim, begun to clear and improve it, and had every reason to believe that with patience and work, he could establish himself as a landowner in a region that was just opening to settlement. Then, while he was away teaching school to earn the cash money that a frontier claim always seemed to require, a man named William Overton had simply walked onto his claim and occupied it. When Bidwell returned, Overton refused to leave. The Missouri courts, bound by the legal complexities of territorial land claims in a recently acquired region where the exact boundaries and procedures were still being worked out, sided with Overton. The details of the legal dispute are lost to history, but the outcome is clear. Just like that, John Bidwell's farm was gone. He was 20 years old, landless and furious. He had done everything he was supposed to do. He had moved west, staked a claim, begun improvements, gone to work to fund his future. And the legal system of the country he lived in had told him it didn't matter, that a man who showed up after him and simply occupied his land had a better claim than he did. It was, as it turned out, a perfect preparation for everything that was about to happen to him. Because what was about to happen to John Bidwell was a journey across 2,000 miles of country that would take everything he thought he knew about the world and dismantle it, piece by piece, until what was left was only what was true. And then a letter arrived. The letter was from John Marsh, a Harvard-educated physician living in California, specifically at his rancho near present-day Brentwood, California, at the foot of Mount Diablo in the eastern San Francisco Bay Area. Marsh had his own complicated history. He had fled the East under a cloud of criminal charges related to illegal trading with Native Americans in Minnesota, had reinvented himself in California, and had built a rancho that was, by 1841, a functioning and reasonably profitable cattle operation. He had trained as a physician, though his Harvard degree was actually in classics, not medicine, a distinction that California's early settlers had little means to verify, and served the surrounding community as the only doctor within a very large radius. Marsh had a shrewd understanding of what American settlers meant for the future of Mexican California, and he wanted more of them. More Americans meant more political pressure on Mexico City. More Americans meant more potential patients, more trading partners, more customers for his cattle. His letter which circulated through the frontier communities of Missouri and Iowa in late 1840, described California in terms that read like a real estate advertisement drafted in paradise. The climate was perfect, the land was fertile, the passes through the mountains were manageable for wagons. The journey was no worse than the trip to Oregon, which a handful of missionaries had already made. The indigenous peoples encountered along the route were, he implied, manageable. What Marsh failed to mention in any detail whatsoever was the vast desert that lay between the Missouri River and those promising mountain passes. He did not describe the Great Basin because he had not crossed it himself. He had come to California by sea. He did not describe the Humboldt Desert or the alkali water of the Humboldt River, or the 40 waterless miles between the river's terminus and the Carson River beyond. He did not describe the eastern face of the Sierra Nevada, which rises from the desert floor in a nearly vertical wall of granite. He described the destination. He left the journey as an exercise for the reader. John Bidwell read the letter and made a decision that would change his life. He would go to California. What happened next was a masterclass in the chaotic, communal, deeply impractical way that frontier migrations actually worked. Bidwell began circulating notices of his own, announcing the formation of the Western Emigration Society in the winter of 1840 to 41. The response was extraordinary. By some accounts, as many as 500 people signed on, agreeing to gather at Sapling Grove in May 1841, equipped and ready. The idea of California, the idea of escape, of starting over, of a new land without the failures of the old one, had enormous emotional power on the Missouri frontier in the winter of 1840 to 41. People who had never met Bidwell signed their names to his circular. People who had never been further west than St. Louis began pricing out wagon equipment. 500. The number must have seemed miraculous to Bidwell when he saw it. The reality, when he arrived at Sapling Grove in the third week of May 1841, was considerably more modest. 500 people had expressed interest. Roughly 500 people had, between the signing of a circular in December and the actual departure point in May, thought better of it. What Bidwell found at Sapling Grove was approximately 69 people, a handful of wagons, and no one with any clear idea of how to proceed. This was, in its way, a perfect encapsulation of the entire enterprise. The gap between the idea of going to California and the act of going to California was not a gap of distance. It was a gap of nerve. The people who showed up at Sapling Grove in May 1841 were the people who had looked at that gap and stepped across it anyway. Not because they were fearless, but because something in their circumstances or their character made staying seem worse than going. Among those 69 people was a complication that Bidwell had not anticipated, a rival for leadership. John Bartleson was a farmer from Missouri who had, by his own estimation, the qualities required to lead a wagon train across an unmapped continent. These qualities were primarily an imposing physical presence and an absolute conviction that he was right about everything. Bartleson had brought a following with him, a group of men who had agreed to travel together and who were loyal to him. And he made clear, shortly after arriving at Sapling Grove, that he expected to be in charge. His method of making this clear was to announce that if he was not elected captain of the party, he would take his people and go home. This was, as a leadership strategy, remarkably effective. Bidwell and the rest of the party, calculating that a smaller group had even less chance of success than a larger one, elected Bartleson captain. And so the expedition that would go down in history as the Bartleson-Bidwell Party had, as its nominal leader, a man who had secured his position through threat rather than merit, and as its actual operational intelligence, a 21-year-old man who had lost his farm to a squatter and had organized half the journey based on a letter from a doctor he had never met. They were, in their way, perfectly representative of the American frontier experience. Also at Sapling Grove, and this detail deserves its own attention because it is one of the most remarkable facts of the entire expedition, was a Jesuit priest. Father Pierre-Jean de Smay was a Belgian-born missionary who had come to North America in the 1820s and had spent the intervening years working among indigenous communities in the Missouri River country. In 1841, he was heading west to establish a mission among the Flathead people in what is now western Montana, a journey that would take him through the first half of the same route the emigrant party needed to travel. With him was Thomas Fitzpatrick. Thomas Fitzpatrick was one of the great practical geniuses of the mountain man era. He had been trapping and trading in the Rocky Mountains since the 1820s, had helped discover South Pass, the great gap in the continental divide that made wagon travel across the Rockies feasible, and had spent 2 decades learning the landscape between the Missouri River and the Pacific watershed with a thoroughness that no map of the period could match. He knew where the water was, he knew which passes a wagon could navigate and which ones could not be navigated at any season. He knew the indigenous nations of the plains and the mountains, their territories, their protocols, their languages. He knew, in the most literal and practical sense, how to travel through the West without dying. He could guide the emigrant party as far as the Green River, where his route diverged northward toward the Flathead country. That was more than half the journey. That was, at that moment, everything. The combined group, De Smet's missionary party, the Bartleson Bidwell emigrants, and Fitzpatrick as guide, left Sapling Grove on May 18, 1841, and headed west along the north bank of the Kansas River into a landscape that most of them had never imagined. Among the 69 people who moved out that morning was the person whose story runs, like a second thread, through the entire journey. Nancy Kelsey. She was 18 years old. She was traveling with her husband, Benjamin Kelsey, who was 23, and their infant daughter, Anne, who was not yet a year old. She was, by every account that has survived, a woman of striking capability, tough, adaptable, and equipped with a practical intelligence that the journey would demand in ways that no one setting out from Sapling Grove could have fully anticipated. She was the only woman in the party who would complete the entire journey to California. Before it was over, she would cross the Sierra Nevada carrying her daughter in her arms, her shoes worn through, her feet bare on the granite. The historical record of Nancy Kelsey's own perspective on the journey is, frustratingly, thin. The accounts that survive were written by men, primarily Bidwell, who were focused on logistics rather than on the experience of the woman and child in their midst. What Nancy herself thought about the desert, the mountains, the months of deprivation and danger, we know only in fragments from late-in-life interviews that captured a few sentences of reflection from a woman who had, by then, seen so much of the West that the 1841 journey had become one episode among many. What those fragments reveal is a woman who did not dramatize what she had done. She had gone because her husband was going. She had done what needed to be done. The baby had survived. They had all survived. That matter-of-factness is, perhaps, the most eloquent thing she could have said. The first weeks were almost ordinary in the way that extreme experiences often begin, a gradual introduction to difficulty that does not yet reveal the full depth of what is coming. The route along the Kansas River and then the Platte was not yet the established highway it would become. In 1841, no wagon train had used this route for a journey to California, and only a handful of missionary groups had gone to Oregon in previous years. But the terrain along the Platte was, if not easy, at least comprehensible. The river provided a reliable guide and a source of water. The prairie was open and rolling. The weather in late May was warm without being brutal. The grass was good, the oxen were strong. Fitzpatrick kept the party moving at a pace that felt agonizingly slow to the eager emigrants, 8 to 15 miles per day, depending on terrain and water, but that an experienced plainsman knew was essential for preserving the animals. The oxen were the lifeblood of the expedition. Everything, every wagon, every barrel of provisions, every family's future rode on the health of those animals. Drive them too hard in the early weeks, when the grass was good and the water was plentiful, and they would fail in the desert when you needed them most. This was not a lesson the emigrants had yet learned. John Bidwell's journal from these early weeks reads like a man discovering a continent in real time. He notes the character of the soil. He describes the birds. He records the distances between water sources with the precision of someone who is already, instinctively, calculating what those distances mean for the days ahead. He writes about the buffalo, first sighted about a week out from Sapling Grove, with a combination of practical enthusiasm and genuine awe. The herds that the party encountered along the Platte were not the remnant populations that later travelers would find. They were the full continent-spanning herds that had grazed the Great Plains for thousands of years, and they stretched from horizon to horizon in numbers that resisted arithmetic. Bidwell records shooting his first buffalo with the kind of detail that suggests it was a significant personal event. The weight of the animal, the difficulty of butchering it, the extraordinary richness of the fresh meat after weeks of trail food. The practical mathematics of buffalo hunting on the move were complicated. The animals were large enough to feed many people, but killing more than you could immediately eat or dry was wasteful in ways that a wagon party moving every morning could not afford. Fitzpatrick enforced protocols about hunting. You took what you needed, you used what you took, that the more impulsive hunters in the party resented, and that the journey would prove were entirely right. By the end of June, the party had covered roughly 500 miles and had reached the North Platte country of present-day western Nebraska. The landscape was changing in ways that the Missouri emigrants found increasingly disorienting. The flat, grassy immensity of the Missouri River prairies was giving way to something rougher, the broken badlands along the North Platte, where years of erosion had carved the limestone and clay into formations that looked to eastern eyes like nothing in the known world. Chimney Rock appeared on the horizon and became, as it would for every subsequent emigrant party, the first unmistakable evidence that they were truly in a different world. The narrow spire of clay and volcanic ash, rising nearly 300 feet from the surrounding formations, visible for miles in the dry air, had no equivalent in the landscape they had left behind. It was a natural monument, dramatic and strange, and Bidwell recorded it with the reverence it deserved. Every significant emigrant journal of the Oregon and California Trail period mentions Chimney Rock. It was the frontier's first landmark, the point at which the journey ceased to be a long walk on a familiar prairie and became something genuinely unknown. Scott's Bluff followed, its dramatic sandstone ramparts rising from the river bottom like the walls of a ruined city. The Laramie Range appeared on the horizon, not the looming, impassable barrier some had feared, but a real mountain range nonetheless. Its presence a reminder that the landscape ahead was going to demand more of them than the landscape behind. Fort Laramie, then still called Fort John, a private fur trading post operated by the American Fur Company, sat at the junction of the North Platte and Laramie rivers. And it was, in 1841, the last fixed point of anything resembling civilization that the party would encounter for a very long time. The fur trade that had built the fort was already in decline. The beaver hat fashion that had sustained it for decades was giving way to silk in eastern markets. But the fort itself was still operational, still stocked with trade goods, still staffed by men who knew the country ahead, and were willing to talk about it. What the mountain men at Fort Laramie said about the country ahead was simultaneously encouraging and insufficient. They could describe the route to South Pass with great precision. Follow the North Platte to the Sweetwater, follow the Sweetwater west and south to the Divide, cross through the broad saddle of South Pass, descend to the Green River. This part they knew. This part Fitzpatrick could have described in his sleep. It was the part beyond the Green River that became, at Fort Laramie in the summer of 1841, a kind of anxious group conversation with no clear resolution. There were men at Fort Laramie who had trapped in the country south of the Snake River and north of the Great Salt Lake. There were men who had traveled the Humboldt River in present-day Nevada. There were men who had crossed the Sierra Nevada from the California side, coming east. But the specific route from the Green River country south and west through the Great Basin to the Sierra Nevada was a patchwork of partial knowledge, conflicting recollections, and gaps that no one present could fill with confidence. One thing that every man at Fort Laramie agreed on: it was a long way, it was a dry way, and the mountains at the western end of it were not the kind of mountains you crossed in a wagon. The party absorbed this information with the selective hearing of people who have committed to a course of action and need to believe it is possible. They rested at Fort Laramie for a day or two, replaced worn equipment, traded for additional provisions, and moved on. The Sweetwater Valley, when they entered it, was one of the most psychologically significant landscapes of the entire journey, not because it was dramatic, but because it was legible. The Sweetwater River ran west-southwest through open, rolling country toward the Wind River Range, and following it required no particular navigation. You simply followed the water uphill until you reached the top of the world. South Pass, when they crested it in the last week of July, was not the dramatic knife-edge summit that the word pass suggested. It was a broad, high basin. The continental divide here was so gradual that travelers often didn't notice the exact moment they crossed it. Bidwell notes the crossing almost matter-of-factly. They were at the top of the continent. Water that ran east from here would eventually reach the Atlantic. Water that ran west would reach the Pacific. They were on the western slope. Fitzpatrick guided them down to the Green River, and at the Green River the party's luck ran out in a specific and foreseeable way. Fitzpatrick was heading north to the Flathead country. The emigrant party was heading west and south toward California. Here, their routes diverged, and here, despite the partial information gathered at Fort Laramie, despite the advice of every mountain man they had spoken with, despite the very clear evidence that the country ahead was largely unknown to them, they had to proceed on their own. Fitzpatrick gave them what guidance he could. Follow the Bear River southwest to the Great Salt Lake. Turn south and west from the lake. Find the Humboldt River and follow it west. When the Humboldt ends, cross the desert to the Sierra Nevada. Then find a pass. He did not know which pass. No wagon had ever found one. He rode north. They watched him go. And then they turned west, into country that no emigrant had ever crossed. The real journey had begun. The question of how a group of 69 people with wagons, oxen, limited provisions, and no reliable guide navigates 2,000 miles of unmapped territory is, at its core, a question about how human beings process uncertainty. Most people confronted with genuine uncertainty of the kind the Bidwell party faced west of the Green River, respond in one of two ways. They either freeze, they stop, wait for more information, refuse to commit to a direction until they know it is the right one, or they keep moving, making the best decision available with the information they have and adjusting as new information arrives. Freezing on the western frontier in the summer of 1841 was not a survivable option. The seasons were moving whether the party was or not. Every day they spent on the Green River was a day closer to the Sierra Nevada snows that would close the passes in October. The calculation was brutal and simple. Move west or die here. They moved west. The Bear River, which they picked up south of the Green River, led them south and southwest through the high basin country of present-day southern Wyoming and northern Utah. It was beautiful country in a severe, demanding way. Open sagebrush flats punctuated by volcanic buttes, watered by streams cold with snowmelt from the mountains to the east. The hunting was reasonable. The animals were still in adequate condition. The weather held. And then, in the first days of August, they reached the Great Salt Lake. Nothing in the experience of anyone in the party had prepared them for what they saw. The Great Salt Lake is one of the strangest bodies of water in North America. It sits in the lowest part of the Great Basin, a remnant of the vastly larger Lake Bonneville that had covered much of Utah during the last ice age. What remains is a shallow, brilliantly blue lake surrounded by flat white salt flats that extend for miles in every direction, the salt crusted and crystalline in the heat, reflecting the sky in a way that makes the horizon meaningless. Nothing lives in it except brine, shrimp, and the birds that eat them. Nothing grows on the flats immediately surrounding it except salt-tolerant shrubs that look, in the heat shimmer of August, like ghosts of more productive vegetation. Bidwell's journal records the sight with a mix of wonder and unease. The water was undrinkable. The surrounding land offered little for the animals. The scale of the thing, the way it filled the valley from mountain range to mountain range, made clear that they were in a different kind of landscape than anything they had crossed before. The Rocky Mountains had been comprehensible, high, demanding, but with rivers and forests and game. This was something else. This was a landscape that was, in some fundamental way, hostile to the requirements of large mammals, including humans. The party skirted the northern end of the lake and turned southwest into the heart of the Great Basin. Here is where the journey began to take its real toll. The Great Basin, the enormous closed drainage system that covers most of Nevada and parts of Utah, California, Oregon, and Idaho, is defined by absence. There is no river that flows through it to the sea. Water that enters it stays. The rivers that run down from the mountains on its edges do not connect to anything beyond. They terminate in playa lakes, salt flats, or marshes, and they evaporate. The vegetation is adapted to profound aridity: sagebrush, shad scale, greasewood, rabbit brush. The soil, where there is soil, is often white or gray with mineral deposits. The distances between reliable water sources are measured not in miles, but in the number of hours it takes an ox to die of thirst. For the Bidwell party, crossing this landscape without a guide who knew where the water was represented a new kind of problem. In the Rockies, finding water had been easy. There were streams everywhere. On the Sweetwater, the route had been defined by the river. Here, in the basin, water was the question that every day's travel had to answer, and answering it wrong meant animals dying and humans dying after them. They were not in this respect entirely without resources. The Paiute and Shoshone peoples who lived in the Great Basin had developed over thousands of years an extraordinarily sophisticated understanding of the basin's water sources, the springs, the seeps, the seasonal streams that appeared in certain drainages after rain and disappeared in others. This knowledge was not written down anywhere that the emigrant party could access. It existed in the memories and practices of the people who had built their lives in this landscape. The party's interactions with Great Basin peoples during this part of the journey were complicated and, by the standards of 1841, relatively careful. Fitzpatrick's training had instilled in Bidwell and others a basic understanding of the protocols of frontier encounter. That aggressive behavior toward indigenous people in unfamiliar territory was suicidal, that trade and communication were far preferable to conflict, and that the people you met in the desert often knew things you desperately needed to know. The party's accounts describe encounters with Basin peoples, primarily Paiute and Shoshone groups, that involved trade, sign language communication, and the extraction of information about water sources ahead. These encounters were not equal. The power differential, a party of armed Americans seeking information from people whose homeland they were crossing without permission, was not lost on anyone. But they were, by the standards of the period, functional. People exchanged goods. Information about water changed hands. The party moved on. By mid-August, they had found the Humboldt River. The Humboldt was, in the context of the Great Basin, a miracle. It was water, moving, continuous, present. It defined a route. You followed it west, through 300 miles of basin and range terrain, until it ended. It provided the single most important resource for both humans and animals. Water to drink, water to cook with, water for the animals to maintain enough strength to keep moving. It was also, and this became apparent within the first days of following it, a deeply miserable river. The Humboldt runs through some of the most arid terrain in North America. Its valley is narrow, often just a thin green strip bordered by brown hills on both sides, hills that yield to mountains, mountains that yield to more mountains in a landscape that is uniform in its hostility and enormous in its scale. The water itself was, in many places, alkaline enough to give humans and animals gastric distress. The grass along its banks was sparse, and by August already drying. The game was minimal. The heat was relentless, and the river was getting worse as they followed it west. The further the party traveled down the Humboldt, the lower the elevation, the drier the climate, the sparser the grass, and the worse the water. The river was, essentially, running downhill into ever more arid conditions, and everything in the valley, the vegetation, the game, the water quality, reflected that descent. By the time they reached the middle Humboldt, the party was rationing everything: grass for the animals, provisions for the humans, the psychological resources that kept people moving forward when every reasonable instinct said stop. The animals were in serious trouble. The oxen and mules that had left Missouri in such good condition were now, after 3 months on the trail and 2 weeks in the Great Basin, visibly diminished. Their ribs showed. Their gait had the slow, mechanical quality of animals running on reserves rather than strength. They were still moving, still pulling what remained of the loads, but the margin was gone. A bad day, a long stretch without water, a section of sand that made pulling twice as hard, could be the day that broke them. Several mules had already died. The party had abandoned wagons at the Humboldt, the first of what would become a cascade of abandonments, each one representing a family's material hopes for California. The wagons came off one at a time. First, the heaviest ones, the ones whose contents could be distributed or left, then the lighter ones as the oxen weakened and the trail grew rougher. Each abandoned wagon was a negotiation. What do you take and what do you leave? The furniture could go, chairs, tables, the domestic furnishings of a Missouri life that had no place in what was coming. The tools were harder, the plow, the saw, the equipment that would start the California farm. But a plow is heavy, and a dead ox pulls nothing. The calculations were brutal and personal and made in the dust by the side of a diminishing river, with the mountains still 100 miles away. By the time the Humboldt ended, by the time the river simply stopped, the water spreading out into a flat, marshy sink that absorbed it completely and left nothing but alkali-crusted mud in every direction. The party had lost most of its wagons and a substantial fraction of its animals. What remained was people, a few surviving animals, and whatever provisions those animals could carry on their backs. And then, beyond the sink, the real desert began. The 40-mile desert, the stretch of waterless terrain between the Humboldt Sink and the Carson River, is one of the most brutal geographic facts in the history of American overland migration. Later emigrants would give it its name, and they would cross it having been warned, and they would still lose animals and people to it in numbers that never fully declined until the railroad made the crossing irrelevant. The Bartleson-Bidwell party crossed it without a name for it and without any clear knowledge of how long it was or what lay on the other side. What they knew was that there was no water between the Sink and the Sierra Nevada unless it could be found somewhere in the 40-odd miles of salt flat, sand dune, and broken rock that lay ahead. What they hoped, based on information gathered from the Paiute people they had encountered, was that a river ran at the base of the mountains on the far side. What they feared was that they were wrong. They crossed at night and in the early morning, which was the right decision. The heat of the Nevada desert in September, in full daylight, would have killed animals and humans who were already near their limits. In the hours before sunrise and in the long twilight after sunset, the temperature dropped enough to make movement possible. They pushed the animals through the dark, guided by the stars and by the faint pale glow of the salt flats that reflected even minimal light. Bidwell's account of the desert crossing is one of the most compressed sections of his journal. He notes the distance, the dying animals, and the total absence of water. And then, he notes their arrival at the Walker River. It was, in the specific context of that arrival, one of the most beautiful things any of them had ever seen. It was cold, fed by snowmelt from the high peaks, and it was real. They had traveled further south than any later emigrant trail would go, striking the mountains at their steepest point. Nancy Kelsey was among, them. Ann Kelsey, the infant, had survived the desert crossing. That fact, the survival of a baby across the 40-mile desert in the arms of an 18-year-old woman on foot, is not something that Bidwell's journal pauses to mark, because Bidwell was not thinking about it the way we think about it now. He was thinking about what came next. What came next was the Sierra Nevada. The Sierra Nevada rose from the valley in front of them with the particular brutality of a mountain range that has no interest in being climbed. The eastern escarpment of the Sierra is not gradual. It rises from the Great Basin floor, which sits at approximately 4,000 feet elevation, to peaks of 12,000 and 13,000 feet in a horizontal distance of roughly 20 miles. The granite face of the range is cut by canyons and river drainages that run roughly east-west, offering corridors up into the mountains, but rarely offering easy crossings of the ridges between them. A pass, a point where the range can be crossed at manageable elevation, exists, but finding it from the Nevada side without a guide who knows it is the work of exploration rather than travel. The party was in no condition for exploration. What they had, as they stared at the Sierra Nevada in early October 1841, was approximately this: a small number of surviving oxen and mules, personal provisions that would last perhaps 2 weeks if carefully rationed, the human energy remaining after 4.5 months on the trail, and a desperate need to cross those mountains before the October snows closed the passes. They also had, in another stroke of the remarkable luck that had characterized this journey, a Paiute man willing to guide them toward the mountains. His name was not recorded. His reasons for helping are not documented. What Bidwell's account tells us is that this man pointed them toward a drainage, what is now the Walker River country, southwest of the present site of Walker Lake, that offered a route up into the Sierra Nevada. Not a pass, exactly, as later immigrants would understand that word. A route. A way that was difficult and demanding, but that could, if everything went reasonably right, be traversed. They followed it. The last wagons had been abandoned in the Nevada Valley. Everything the party owned was now on the backs of the surviving animals, or in the arms and packs of the humans themselves. The trail, such as it was, such as they made it as they went, wound up through sagebrush and dry grass into the juniper woodland of the Sierra foothills, then into the pine forest of the middle elevations, then above the pines into the high granite country, where the trees thinned and the rock took over and the air thinned along with everything else. The animals struggled with the grade. Oxen are powerful animals on flat ground and moderate slopes. On steep, loose terrain, they lose their footing, their confidence, and their will. The surviving oxen and mules were driven up the steepest sections, their loads redistributed or carried by humans to keep the animals from going down. Some fell. Some were killed for food, at points where the party needed provisions more than they needed the animals' continued labor. Nancy Kelsey climbed carrying Anne. Her shoes had not survived the desert. She climbed in her bare feet. Bidwell does not make a great deal of this in his account. He notes it. He notes other things as well: the condition of the animals, the quality of the grazing at various camps, the distances covered, and Nancy Kelsey's barefoot Sierra crossing appears among these other notes as a fact, recorded without particular emphasis, because emphasis would have required him to stop and feel the full weight of what he was witnessing, and he could not afford to stop. The crossing took several days. The exact route the party used in 1841 is not with precision documented. It was not the Donner Pass route that later emigrants would use, and it was not the Beckworth Pass further north. Most historians believe the party crossed somewhere in the Stanislaus River drainage through terrain that was possible but not kind. From the summit of the crossing, they looked west. The description of this moment, the first sight of California from the Sierra crest, appears in multiple accounts of the journey, written by different men with different relationships to language, and they all reach for the same inadequate words. The valley below was vast and golden in the October light. It extended further than the eye could easily follow, north and south, a breadth of fertile land that made everything they had crossed to reach it seem momentarily worth it. Then they had to get down from the summit, which turned out to be harder than getting up. The western slope of the Sierra is longer than the eastern. The range tilts, in geological terms, with a steep eastern face and a gradual western slope. The descent from the high country to the Central Valley is measured in dozens of miles rather than the tens of miles of the eastern escarpment. But length does not mean ease. The canyons that cut the western slope are deep and steep-sided, and the rivers in them run cold and fast in October, when the first autumn rains have added their water to the snowmelt that never fully stops. The party descended through pine forest, and then through foothill oak woodland, and then through the chaparral and grassland of the lower elevations, following the Stanislaus River drainage toward the valley floor. Animals were killed for food along the way. The provisions were nearly gone. The humans were at the limit of what months of continuous physical effort and inadequate nutrition had left in them. But the mountains were behind them, and ahead, May finally, unmistakably, was California. They arrived at John Marsh's rancho in the first days of November 1841, 5.5 months after leaving Sapling Grove. Of the 32 people who had separated from the Oregon contingent at the Green River and headed for California, 31 had made it to the Central Valley. Of the 32 people who had separated from the Oregon contingent at Soda Springs and headed for California, every single one of them made it to the Central Valley. Charles Hopper, a veteran hunter who some thought might turn back, stayed with the group and became essential to their survival, helping scout the way through the high granite. Despite the starvation and the fear that they were walking into a death trap, the group's bond held. No one was left behind in the Nevada desert. John Marsh received them with the hospitality of a man who had been loudly inviting people to come visit him and was now faced with the actual reality of people having done so. He charged them for food. He questioned the legality of their presence in Mexican California. He was, by virtually every account from people who knew him, one of the more unpleasant personalities in early California. Brilliant, educated, and possessed of a talent for self-promotion that was matched only by his talent for making people dislike him in person. His letters to Missouri had described California as paradise. His reception of the people those letters had helped lure west was considerably less paradisiacal. Bidwell was furious. He was also exhausted, fed, and alive, and he was smart enough to understand that those three facts outweighed the irritation of Marsh's bad manners. They had made it. The question of what they had made was about to become considerably more complicated. California in November 1841 was not, in any simple sense, the promised land that John Marsh's letters had described. It was undeniably beautiful. The Central Valley in autumn was a landscape of golden grass and blue oak woodland, traversed by rivers that ran cold and clear from the Sierra Nevada to the west. The soil was exactly what Marsh had claimed. Extraordinarily fertile, the product of millions of years of alluvial deposits from the mountain ranges on either side. The climate was mild in ways that Missouri winters had made almost impossible to imagine. But California was also a society in the late stages of a profound political crisis, and the American settlers now arriving were not guests in that crisis. They were, whether they intended it or not, a destabilizing force. Mexico's hold on California had been weakening for 2 decades. The secularization of the missions in 1833 had disrupted the social order that had organized California life for 50 years, releasing tens of thousands of neophyte workers from the mission system into an economy that had no clear place for them. The great rancho families, the Californios who had built their estates on mission-era land, grants, and mission-era labor, were politically dominant but numerically thin, and their relationship with the central government in Mexico City was increasingly strained. American and European traders had been integrating themselves into California's commercial life for years, and the culture of the coastal towns was already becoming something that the Spanish colonial founders of those towns would not have recognized. Into this unstable mixture, the Bartleson-Bidwell party dropped themselves like a stone into still water. Not all at once, and not with any coordinated plan. The party dispersed after reaching Marsh's rancho, its members finding employment and land and futures in the ways available to them. John Bidwell went to work for John Sutter, the Swiss entrepreneur whose fort at the junction of the American and Sacramento rivers was becoming the operational center of the American settler community in California. Benjamin and Nancy Kelsey moved into the Sacramento Valley. Other, Party members spread through the small communities of California's interior. They were, by 1841 standards, a successful immigration. They had crossed a continent in wagons, or most of the way in wagons, before the terrain stripped the wagons away. And they had arrived. The number of Americans in California jumped meaningfully with their arrival. The knowledge they carried back east, in letters and journals and direct testimony, was the first reliable overland account of the route to California. And that knowledge, as it circulated, changed everything. What the Bartleson-Bidwell party had done, in the most practical terms, was prove something. They had proved that ordinary people, not mountain men, not trained explorers, not soldiers, could cross the continent to California overland. They had proved it imperfectly, expensively, with tremendous suffering and significant loss of equipment. They had arrived stripped of almost everything material that they had set out with. But they had arrived. All but one of them had arrived. In the history of exploration and migration, proof is everything. The thing that has never been done is unknown territory in the deepest sense. It lives in the imagination as impossible, or nearly so. Once it has been done, once a specific person or group of people has actually traveled the route, has actually found the water and crossed the desert and climbed the mountain, it moves from imagination into fact. It becomes a thing that can be done because it has been done. John Bidwell understood this. In the years after 1841, he made sure that what he knew was available to the people who came after him. His accounts of the journey, first circulated in letters and in conversations with other emigrants, later formalized in the Century magazine articles he wrote in 1890, were careful, specific, and honest about both what he had gotten right and what he had gotten catastrophically wrong. What he had gotten right, the general route from Missouri to the Green River, following the Platte and Sweetwater to South Pass, was achievable. The Rocky Mountains could be crossed. South Pass was real and manageable for wagons. With adequate preparation and good luck, the first half of the journey could be made. What he had gotten wrong, or rather, what he had not known and could not have known. The Great Basin was far worse than anyone had told him. The Humboldt River was not the straightforward highway to the Sierra that it appeared on the rough maps available in Missouri. The desert crossing between the Humboldt Sink and the Sierra Nevada was a genuine life-or-death test that required specific knowledge and preparation. The Sierra Nevada itself could not be crossed in wagons, not by the route they had used, and probably not by any route, using the wagons and oxen they had brought. These corrections, when circulated among the emigrant community of the early 1840s, were immediately valuable. Emigrants who came after the Bartleson-Bidwell party knew to prepare more water for the desert crossing. They knew to consider abandoning wagons before the Sierra, rather than carrying them to exhaustion. They knew the approximate length of the Great Basin section, and could calculate their provisions accordingly. They could choose their departure dates more carefully, leaving Missouri early enough to cross the Sierra before October snows, late enough that the early prairie sections had adequate grass. None of this made the journey easy. Nothing could make the journey easy. The desert was still the desert. The mountains were still the mountains. The distance was still the distance. But the difference between crossing the Nevada desert with no knowledge of what lay ahead and crossing it with a rough but genuine account from someone who had done it was the difference between walking blindfolded through a minefield and walking through it with a partial map. The partial map didn't guarantee your survival, but it improved your odds in ways that were both real and compounding over time. Each party that followed the Bartleson-Bidwell route left the route incrementally better defined. They identified better water sources. They found improved crossings of the critical rivers. They located mountain passes that were more manageable for wagons. Most importantly, the passes through the northern Sierra Nevada that became the Donner Pass route in 1846, and that carried the vast majority of California-bound emigrants after that. They established the distance between water sources with greater precision. They noted which sections of the Humboldt River Valley offered adequate grass and which sections were essentially barren. They built on what Bidwell had done, adding to it, improving it, carrying it forward. The knowledge accumulated. The route became more defined, better documented, more survivable. By 1845, a wagon train could attempt the California Trail with something approaching genuine guidance. Not a perfect guide, but an actual document, a compiled account of the route based on the experience of multiple parties that described the critical sections with enough precision to allow planning rather than improvisation. This was a different world from the one John Bidwell had set out into in 1841. And then, in 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill on the American River, 40 miles from Sutter's Fort, where Bidwell had worked in 1841 and 1842. The California Trail that Bidwell had helped pioneer suddenly had to carry not the hundreds of emigrants that had used it in the mid-1840s, but tens of thousands. In 1849 alone, approximately 90,000 people made the overland journey to California, a number that strained the trail's water sources, its grass, its practical limitations, in ways that created new crises, even as it built on the Mooks route that earlier emigrants had established. The Donner Party tragedy of 1846-47, the most famous disaster in the history of overland emigration, happened on the same basic route that Bidwell had pioneered, on a late-season crossing made by a party that had trusted bad advice about a shortcut through the salt desert south of the Great Salt Lake. The gold rush transformed California from a remote destination for a few hundred adventurous emigrants into the center of one of the most significant events in 19th-century American history. It brought 100,000 people to a landscape in the course of 2 or 3 years. It built cities. It created an economy. It accelerated California's admission to the Union in 1850, 9 years after the Bartleson-Bidwell party had arrived at Marsh's Rancho, and it destroyed much of what had been there before. The Miwok people of the Sierra Nevada foothills and the Central Valley had lived in that landscape for at least 3,000 years, and possibly much longer. Their communities were organized around intimate knowledge of the specific resources of specific places, the locations of particular oak groves whose acorns were especially productive, the streams where certain fish ran in certain seasons, the meadows where particular plant foods could be gathered at particular times of year. Their management of the landscape was not passive. They burned the grasslands systematically to improve grazing for deer and elk, to clear undergrowth in the oak woodland, to stimulate the growth of the plant foods they depended on. The productive, park-like landscape that American emigrants described when they first entered the Central Valley was, in significant part, a managed landscape, the result of thousands of years of careful indigenous land management. The Yokuts people of the southern Central Valley had their own sophisticated ecological knowledge, their own political structures, their own trade networks connecting them to communities across a vast area. The Maidu of the northern foothills, the Nisenan of the American River drainage, the Miwok of the central foothills, each nation was distinct with its own language, its own territory, its own history. The Bartleson-Bidwell party passed through Miwok and Yokuts territory in its final weeks. The accounts they left behind mention indigenous peoples in the context of the specific assistance those peoples provided, guidance toward the mountains, information about routes, occasional trade. The people who provided this assistance are not named. Their own accounts of the encounter, if they maintained oral traditions about it, if their descendants remember it, were not recorded in the documents that historians have access to. What we know is what happened after. The gold rush of 1848 and its aftermath were catastrophic for California's indigenous peoples in ways that are difficult to fully convey without numbers that resist comprehension. In 1848, the indigenous population of California was estimated at approximately 150,000 people. By 1870, it had fallen to approximately 30,000, by 1880 to perhaps 20,000. The causes were multiple and intersecting. Disease, smallpox, cholera, typhoid, and a dozen others killed people whose communities had no prior exposure and, therefore, no immunity. The hydraulic mining that tore apart the Sierra Nevada foothills to wash gold out of the ancient riverbeds sent walls of debris and toxin into the rivers and valleys, destroying the fisheries and the plant communities that indigenous peoples depended on. The American settlers who poured into the interior valleys took land that had supported specific communities for generations, fenced it, plowed it, converted it to agriculture in ways that made the original uses impossible, and in some cases, the violence was direct. California in the 1850s and 1860s saw campaigns of extermination against indigenous communities that were organized, funded, and in some instances participated in by state government. The California legislature appropriated money for militia expeditions against native peoples. American settlers killed families in their villages. The historical record, contemporary newspaper accounts, military reports, legislative records, documents this with the matter-of-fact quality of people who did not consider what they were doing to be remarkable. This is part of the story of the Bartleson-Bidwell Party, whether or not the party intended it. The trail they blazed became the road over which the gold rush traveled. The gold rush produced the destruction of indigenous California. These are not separate stories. They are one story, and choosing to tell only the part about the brave emigrants and the heroic crossing is a choice. Not a historical accident, but a decision about what to notice and what to set aside. The Bartleson-Bidwell Party did not intend this. John Bidwell, in his later life, expressed genuine concern about the treatment of California's indigenous peoples. He employed Mecho-Uptamaidu workers at Rancho Chico in a relationship that was deeply paternalistic. He required them to adopt Western dress and attend church, but he also provided a rare degree of protection. While the rest of the state was engaged in a funded war of extermination against native communities, Bidwell used his power to ensure the Mecho-Opta had a place to remain on their ancestral lands. It was a complicated, imperfect sanctuary, but in Gilded Age California, it was an anomaly. Acknowledging it was not the same as preventing it, and nothing Bidwell could have done individually would have been. The forces that destroyed indigenous California were systemic: the gold rush, the land rush, the political economy of American expansion, and they were larger than any individual conscience. But the acknowledgement matters. It suggests that at least some of the people who made the California Trail understood, on some level, what they had set in motion. John Bidwell spent the rest of his long life in California, and that life was remarkable in ways that the 21-year-old standing at Sapling Grove in 1841 could not have imagined. After working for Sutter in the early 1840s, he established himself as a farmer. In July 1848, only months after the initial discovery at Sutter's mill, Bidwell found gold himself on the Feather River. He established what became known as Bidwell's Bar, a discovery that would have made most men wealthy beyond the need to do anything else. But Bidwell was a farmer at heart, not a miner. He used the gold he pulled from the river to fund the purchase of the land that would become his true legacy. He purchased Rancho Chico in 1849, approximately 22,000 acres in the Sacramento Valley, in the shadow of the Coast Ranges. The name came from the rancho that had previously occupied the land under Mexican land grant. Bidwell kept the name and transformed the property over the following decades into one of the most productive farms in California. He grew wheat, which the Sacramento Valley produced in extraordinary quantities in the early agricultural period. He planted orchards, almonds, olives, grapes, and dozens of varieties of fruit and nut trees that he gathered from around the world in a spirit of agricultural experimentation that reflected both his intellectual curiosity and his deep investment in making things grow. He donated land for a town, Chico, which grew up adjacent to the rancho. He donated land for a church and for the public buildings a growing community required. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1865, serving one term in a Congress consumed by Reconstruction. He ran for governor of California 3 times, in 1867, 1875, and 1890, and lost each time, in part because of his increasingly prominent association with the Prohibition movement. In 1868, he married Annie Ellicott Kennedy, a woman from Washington, D.C., who had been a student at Mount Holyoke Seminary, the daughter of a prominent family, and a graduate of a classical education that was, in 1868 California, unusual for a woman. Annie Bidwell became, in many ways, the social and moral center of Rancho Chico. She was deeply religious, Presbyterian, and her influence pushed John Bidwell toward the temperance and prohibition positions that defined his later political life. She was also a committed advocate for the Meco-Opta Maidu community that lived on and near the rancho, and her efforts to protect those people's land claims and cultural continuity represented a level of indigenous advocacy unusual in Gilded Age California. The Meco-Opta community that lived at Rancho Chico was the remnant of a people who had been reduced by Gold Rush-era violence and disease from thousands to dozens. Their relationship with the Bidwells was complex. They were laborers on land that had once been theirs, protected by a family whose power derived in part from the same system of land seizure that had dispossessed them. Annie Bidwell's advocacy operated within those contradictions rather than resolving them. She tried to secure the Meco-Opta's right to remain on the land. She tried to ensure their children had access to education. She tried to preserve some record of their language and culture. None of this was enough to undo what had been done, but it was real, and it was more than most. John Bidwell died at Rancho Chico on April 4, 1900, at the age of 80. He was the last survivor of the original Bartleson-Bidwell party, outliving Nancy Kelsey, who died in 1896, and most of the others by many years. He had seen California transform, over the course of his lifetime, from a Mexican rancho territory of perhaps 15,000 settlers into an American state of more than 1 million people. He had watched the landscapes he had crossed on foot become farmland, then city, then the sinews of a continental economy. His Rancho Chico is now the site of California State University, Chico. The town he founded is a city of 90,000 people. A state park near the rancho bears his name. The creek that runs through the city is called Bidwell Creek. Nancy Kelsey's story after 1841 is, in many ways, the more remarkable of the two, not because of what she accomplished in her later years, though she accomplished a great deal, but because of the sheer quantity of the frontier West that she witnessed and survived. After settling briefly in California in the early 1840s, she and Benjamin Kelsey were on the move again almost immediately. Benjamin Kelsey was, by most accounts, a restless man. and Nancy Kelsey was a woman who followed her husband into whatever the frontier demanded. They were in California during the Bear Flag Republic Revolt of 1846, which Nancy witnessed directly. They moved through Oregon and back to California. They were in Texas, where Nancy's family had connections. They were in California again during the Gold Rush years. Ann Kelsey, the infant who had crossed the Sierra Nevada in her mother's arms, grew to adulthood and had children of her own. Nancy became a grandmother while still young enough to be, by any reasonable standard, a young woman. The late-in-life interviews that provide our most direct access to Nancy Kelsey's own voice describe a woman who had lived through so much of the history of the American West that the 1841 crossing had become, for her, one episode among many. She recalled it with precision but without drama. The mountains had been cold, the food had been short, the baby had been heavy. She had done what needed to be done. When asked in one of those late interviews whether she regretted making the journey, she said something that has become the most frequently quoted thing she ever said, that she had gone to California and she had no regrets, but that if she had to do it again, she would wait for a better map. She died in Fresno County, California in 1896 at the age of 73. A historical marker in the Sierra Nevada commemorates the crossing she made with her daughter. Stonewall County in Texas was renamed Borden County. The historical connections of Nancy Kelsey's family to Texas frontier history are preserved in the names of places she never saw grow up. She is buried in an unmarked grave. That last fact, the unmarked grave of the woman who carried a baby across the Sierra Nevada on bare feet, the woman whose name is on an official historical marker but whose burial place was not considered worth recording, is not an accident of history. It is a reflection of the systematic way in which women's contributions to the American frontier were acknowledged in the abstract and disregarded in the specific. Their stories were noted. Their graves were not marked. Their own words were not preserved with the care that was given to the words of the men around them. The historical record we have of Nancy Kelsey is, in large part, the record John Bidwell made of her. That is something. It is also not enough. The California Trail that the Bartleson-Bidwell party blazed in 1841 was, within a generation, one of the most heavily traveled roads in the world. The route they pioneered, from Missouri, along the Platte to South Pass, down to the Green River, across the Great Basin following the Humboldt, and over the Sierra Nevada, became, with refinements and corrections, the standard overland route to California. Between 1841 and 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad made the overland wagon journey unnecessary, approximately 250,000 people used that route to reach California. They are buried along it, many of them. The cholera epidemic of 1849 killed thousands on the trail, and their graves stretched from the Missouri River to the Sierra Nevada in a long, ragged line that one traveler compared to the bones of a dragon. The 40-mile desert was littered with the carcasses of oxen and mules, and here and there, the hastily dug graves of humans who had come within sight of the Sierra Nevada and not quite made it. The trail itself has been substantially erased. Interstate 80 follows it across the Great Basin. The Humboldt River Valley, through which the Bartleson-Bidwell party traveled in desperate conditions in the late summer of 1841, is now divided by a 4-lane highway and surrounded by irrigated agriculture. The 40-mile desert, which nearly killed the first party to cross it, is crossed by most American drivers in about 40 minutes. What remains is the land itself, stripped of the context that makes it comprehensible. You can still, if you look carefully, find the ruts of wagon wheels pressed into the earth along certain sections of the Great Plains. You can still find the carved names of emigrants in the soft stone of Independence Rock, where the Sweetwater River meets the Platte Country, and where parties camped on the 4th of July and carved their names into the rock because they were alive and they wanted to remember it. You can hike through emigrant wilderness in the Sierra Nevada and feel the specific difficulty of the terrain that Nancy Kelsey climbed in her bare feet. The loose granite, the exposed ridges, the altitude that shrinks the breath and makes the legs heavy. The people who made the first crossing are gone. The documents they left behind are available in archives and in published collections for anyone who wants to read them. Bidwell's Century magazine articles are digitized. His journals are preserved. The fragments of Nancy Kelsey's recorded speech are in the historical record, waiting. What is not in the record, what cannot be recovered, is the experience of the Miwok guide who pointed the exhausted, desperate party toward a route up into the mountains in October 1841. It is the experience of the Paiute communities who watched the wagon party cross their territory and made their own calculations about what these Americans represented. It is the experience of the Humboldt Sink's first people watching wagons cross their homeland on their way to transforming it into something unrecognizable. That silence in the record is not neutral. It reflects a recording system that was built by and for the people doing the expanding, that systematically omitted the perspectives of the people being expanded upon. It is a silence that historians and writers and storytellers have a responsibility to name, even when they cannot fill it. The Bartleson-Bidwell party was the first. They blazed the trail. They proved it possible. They suffered for it, and they survived it. And the country that came after them was shaped by what they did. That country was also built on the remains of what was there before them, and the people who built it are the ones who left the records, and the records reflect what the builders chose to see. The full story of the California Trail requires holding both of those things at once, the real courage of the people who crossed it, and the real cost to the people who were already there. Neither diminishes the other. Both are true. History demands both. There is a specific moment in John Bidwell's account of the 1841 journey that has stayed with me since I first read it. It occurs not at a dramatic high point, not at the crossing of the Sierra Nevada, not at the first sight of California, but in the middle of the Nevada desert, somewhere along the desiccated lower Humboldt River, when the wagons were already failing and the animals were already dying, and the distance still to be covered was still measured in hundreds of miles. He writes that he did not know if they were going to make it. He writes it plainly, without elaboration, and then he continues with his account. But in that plainness is something that the heroic version of frontier history tends to edit out, the real uncertainty of it. These were not heroes who knew they would succeed. They were ordinary people who did not know, who could not know, who kept moving anyway, not because they were certain of the outcome, but because the alternative was to stop and die where they were. That is, in some ways, a more interesting story than the triumphalist version. The triumphalist version requires its protagonists to be more than human, braver, tougher, more certain, and in requiring that, it makes them less real. The actual story of John Bidwell and Nancy Kelsey and the 67 other people who left Sapling Grove in May 1841 is the story of people who were uncertain and afraid and exhausted and who kept going anyway, one day at a time, making the best decisions available to them with the information they had. That is the human story underneath the historical one. And it is, in the end, the one that matters most. The California Trail they blazed is Interstate 80 now. The Sierra Nevada pass they could not find is crossed by 4 lanes of highway. The Great Basin they crossed on foot, is crossed by most Americans in an afternoon, air-conditioned, listening to music. And somewhere in Fresno County, in an unmarked grave, lies the woman who carried her daughter across the mountains on her bare feet, who said she had no regrets but wished for a better map, and who left this world without a stone above her name. The stone is this: she was there. She did it. We know because someone wrote it down. That will have to be enough. If this story moved you, leave a like so others can find it. Thanks for spending time with Western Pioneer Archives.